So many things went wrong with this build, including how we left it out in the rain overnight, but we still somehow managed to get this thing working, and the total build cost was only $177. This is how we did it. But real quickly before moving on, we gotta take a quick second to thank today's video sponsor, Corsair, and specifically their new super innovative RMX Shift power supplies. Just like the name suggests, these units shift all of the modular power connectors to the rear and more accessible side of your PC build, and this can streamline your building and especially upgrading process. A year down the line, when you go to upgrade your PC, it can be a real nightmare digging through that rat's nest of PSU cables in the basement, and shifting these connectors over makes removing or adding cables a breeze. This is also an ATX 3.0 80 plus gold certified unit, it's PCIe Gen 5 ready, and there's even a 0 RPM mode if you're trying to build a silent beast. This PSU pairs perfectly with case options like the Corsair 5000D, and you can grab one for yourself or just learn more by clicking that first link down in the description. This was originally supposed to be a $150 build, and I'll admit that's not much cheaper than the $177 that we paid, but this was also supposed to have a way different theme than what you're looking at now. We had multiple issues along the way with this build, and it was a reminder that turning an old office OEM PC into a gaming PC isn't always 100% easy and guaranteed, so I'll share with you all today what went wrong, but also how this can play literally every game in 2023 still quite successfully. Starting with the base of this build, shout out is needed again to Nemes in the Discord server for finding a $35 Dell Optiplex 54MT. Regardless of the specs, $35 for a completely running and working system is already a good deal, but check out these specs. Inside, it came with a 4-core Intel Skylake i5-6500, which is still pretty decent. It came with 8GB of DDR4 RAM and even a 1TB hard drive. Now, by itself, it's obviously not going to play any games smoothly with just those specs alone, so we're lacking a couple of upgrades here, so let's talk about those. First up was the storage, and although I'm indeed a big fan when these builds come with a 1TB drive, we certainly needed to get some SSD speeds in here, so I bought the cheapest NVMe drive that I could find, which was this Inland 256GB model for 19 bucks. If you find an OEM build without any storage whatsoever, then you obviously need a much bigger one as your main drive, but with this setup, we'll be able to store our operating system as well as a few games on the much faster NVMe drive, but then we also have a much bigger game and media library on the 1TB HDD. Now for RAM, you certainly could make a case for upgrading to 16GB, and for most people, I would indeed recommend doing that, but I personally really wanted to keep the cost of this build down as low as possible, so I just stuck with the 8GB. We'll see soon in the benchmarking section that we still played all of the titles perfectly fine, but there are some games which would utilize the 16GB, so realistically, most people are going to tack on another 30 bucks or so for a RAM upgrade. There are 2 open RAM slots in most of these mid-tower OEMs. The other thing that we of course need inside a build like this is a graphics card, and for today's video, we're doing something a little bit different that I don't typically recommend doing. Just for the sake of experimenting and keeping things fresh on the channel, instead of getting the typical small form factor GPU that doesn't require external power such as an RX 6400 or GTX 1650, I decided to opt for a little bit more powerful GTX 1650 Super that needs a 6-pin power connector. The problem is that most of these ultra cheap OEM builds don't come with a 6 or 8-pin GPU power connector, so here's where you gotta get a little crafty. We needed to buy one of these dual SATA power to 6-pin power adapters, and these are usually frowned upon in our PC building community. This isn't as safe as a normal connector, obviously, and most people completely disregard the power recommendations that adapters like this post, and sometimes they'll end up catching on fire or hurting some of your components. Now, I'm not gamer's Nexus level of smart when it comes to this kind of stuff, but what I do know is that a typical GTX 1650 Super only consumes around 100 watts of power. Since 70 to 75 watts comes from the motherboard, that means there's not actually a ton of power going through the 6-pin connector. According to Cable Matters, which is the manufacturer of this adapter, these have a max power rating of 75 watts, so that seems perfectly fine for me. These products are also specifically developed and marketed as a solution for a graphics card when your power supply doesn't have a 6-pin connector, so honestly, there shouldn't be that big of a risk, especially from a reputable brand like Cable Matters. Now, because of that 75 watt limit, you're indeed very limited on which GPUs you can power with an adapter like this. I definitely would not recommend powering an RTX 3000 series graphics cards with these, but for just a measly 1650 Super, let's roll the dice. Before we do roll that dice though, I want to quickly mention that I did originally buy a normal GTX 1650 that also required a 6-pin power connector. I got this MSI model, but it ended up not actually fitting inside our build, and this is all always a concern for these types of builds. On paper, it was supposed to fit according to the dimensions, and I even fit the graphics card physically inside of there, but once the 6-pin power adapter was plugged in, the side panel wasn't able to fully close. Thankfully, I did have this EVGA 1650 Super model available from a previously failed experiment just like this one, so we were good to go. Long story short, if you're trying to follow this along at home, then just try to get the smallest possible graphics card, that way you don't have any issues like this. The other issue we ran into was in the aesthetics department, and this build ended up looking way more boring than I originally planned. Spray painting OEMs like this has become my specialty, and I actually enjoy doing it. You just grab a can of paint, make sure to only spray those first few coats at a very low opacity, and with some patience and 8 or 9 coats or so, it'll turn out amazing. The one thing you gotta remember though is that if you leave this outside to dry, then make sure you bring it inside before a rainstorm. We failed to do that. Not gonna name drop anyone here, but let's just say one of my employees forgot to bring the panels inside.
You got me.
And when I drove to work the next day, again in the pouring down rain, I saw that the panels were completely soaked in water and the paint was all chipped up. After taking some deep breaths so I didn't fire anybody right on the spot, I brought the PC inside, I dried it off, and it didn't completely ruin our project, but it did kind of derail it a little bit. I was actually planning on using these camo stencils to then paint a black camo design on here, and this would have turned into a super sick looking black and white camo build. But because the panels were all wet, there's no way I could have painted it on that day, and since YouTube projects and sponsorships and all that have deadlines, we just had to scrap that part of the project and move on. The other issue was that some of this paint got messed up from leaving it out overnight. Rocks, leaves, and bugs must have been having a party on these panels because the paint was all chipped up, but thankfully I have one of these white Sharpies and I just did some touch-up work on all the spots and the build is still thankfully looking decent. Regardless of all this, we still ended up with a sub $200 fully working gaming PC that's looking somewhat clean, so let's move on to the stress testing and benchmarking section to make sure that all of this chaos was actually worth it. Before benchmarking with games, we first wanted to run a proper GPU stress test just to make sure that the SATA to 6-pin adapter was solid and wasn't going to catch on fire or anything. We do have an extinguisher readily available in the studio for exact scenarios like this. And also, since I'm going to be selling this build on the 1st of April during our monthly website restock on zttbuilds.com, we definitely need to make sure that this is safe before selling it to someone else. Buy this at your own risk, by the way. So for testing, we ran a 3D Mark TimeSpy loop GPU stability run and ended up getting a 98.8% stability rating after 20 runs, and that's certainly a success. Again, I don't think we have an actual power issue here because it's just a 1650 Super, but I wanted to make sure that we properly stress tested it in case if you're trying to follow this along at home. Switching over to the normal benchmarks though, we got some pretty great results on this one as well, and let's take a look at some of these. For Apex Legends in 1080p with low settings, we got 110 average FPS, and even that 1% low is hovering right above 60, which means this was a pretty smooth playing experience. Same thing with Fortnite, we got a 139 average FPS, and that 1% low did drop a little bit like it so often does on budget builds, but this result was still very solid for a $177 system. And games like Grand Theft Auto 5 that rely more on the CPU even got above 60 FPS with an average of 77 using 1080p in normal/medium settings. Here's the full benchmarking run that we did with 20 games, and you can see here that games like Elden Ring and Cyberpunk are certainly going to be a challenge as we could only play in 720p low. But then we also have surprisingly good results on games like Modern Warfare 2 hitting almost 60 FPS, CSGO getting 171, and Minecraft can easily be played on this PC with 272 FPS. Honestly, despite all the troubles that we had with this PC, I'm very happy with how it turned out, and if you're having some own PC building struggles of your own, then I'm actually available to help some of you out. Now, this isn't free because I'm a busy man running a business, dad life, trying to get jacked and all that, but if you seriously want my help, then check out my consulting services over on zackstechdrift.com/consulting. I'll help you build the parts list of your next gaming PC dream, and you'll be getting the full-on aesthetics over everything Zack mindset, or however you want your own build to look and perform. I'll have the link to that down in the description. And if you're looking for some more ideas on how to build a sub $200 or $250 build, then feel free to click the video that's on the screen now.